January 14th, 1945. The Bavarian Alps. Sergeant Carl Jensen's world ended in fire and ice. His B-17 flying fortress, crippled by flak over Munich, screamed through the frozen sky like a dying animal. The radio operator's station, his domain for 18 months of missions, had become a coffin of twisted metal and sparking wires. Through the chaos, through the wind howling through the shattered fuselage, Jensen heard the pilot's final order. Bail out now. He pulled the ripcord at 8,000 feet. The parachute snapped open, jerking him so hard he thought his spine would crack. Below him, his fortress spiraled into a mountainside, exploding in an orange fireball that lit up the winter darkness. Jensen was alone, 23 years old, deep in Nazi Germany, and he had absolutely no idea that his war was about to become something no training manual could have prepared him for. Because in less than 2 hours, he would meet 4 women who would shatter every assumption he held about enemy territory, about faith, about courage. 4 women who were already hiding a secret so dangerous that discovery meant immediate execution. And they were about to add 1 American airman to their deadly gamble. This is the story of how a radio operator from Minnesota learned that the most profound acts of resistance don't happen on battlefields. They happen in silence, in shadows, in the daily choices of people who refuse to let evil define their humanity. And it begins with a crash landing that should have been a death sentence. Jensen hit the ground hard in a snow-covered forest, his ankle twisting beneath him with a crack that sent white-hot pain shooting up his leg. He lay there for a moment, gasping, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. Temperature maybe 10 degrees. No survival gear beyond his flight suit and the small emergency kit every airman carried. A compass, a silk map. 40 Reichsmarks in occupation currency. A .45 pistol with 1 magazine. The manual said to move immediately, to put distance between yourself and the crash site before German patrols arrived. Jensen tried to stand and nearly blacked out from the pain. His ankle wasn't broken, but it was badly sprained. He could walk, but not far, not fast. Through the trees he could see lights. A village maybe 2 miles distant. His training screamed at him to avoid civilization, to head for the hills, to try reaching Allied lines. But Allied lines were hundreds of miles west, and he was injured, and the temperature was dropping. Carl Jensen made a decision that probably saved his life. He started limping toward those lights. What he found wasn't a village. It was something he hadn't expected to see in the heart of Nazi Germany, a convent. The building rose from the snow like something from a medieval fairy tale. Stone walls 3 feet thick, a small chapel with a bell tower that pierced the night sky, a wooden gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Jensen approached carefully, his hand on his pistol. Every instinct told him this was insane. These were Germans, the enemy. They would turn him over to the Gestapo before he could finish introducing himself. But he was out of options. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed in the courtyard beyond. For a long moment, nothing. Then he heard footsteps, a bolt sliding back. The door opened 6 inches, revealing a face that would haunt Jensen's memory for the rest of his life. Sister Maria was perhaps 60 years old, with eyes that seemed to look straight through him. She took in his flight suit, his injured leg, his obvious American identity, and she did something that defied all logic. She opened the door wider. She spoke in German, words Jensen couldn't understand. He responded in English, explaining he was American, that he needed help, that he understood if she had to report him. Sister Maria's expression didn't change. She simply reached out, grabbed his arm with surprising strength, and pulled him inside. Then she closed and bolted the door. What happened next moved so fast that Jensen barely processed it. Two more nuns appeared, both elderly, both moving with urgent efficiency. They stripped off his flight suit, replacing it with rough civilian clothes that smelled of mothballs. They wrapped his ankle in cloth bandages soaked in something that burned and soothed simultaneously. They gave him water, black bread, a thin soup that tasted like heaven. And through it all, Sister Maria watched him with those penetrating eyes. She spoke no English, he spoke no German, but when she gestured for him to follow her, he understood perfectly. They climbed narrow stone stairs, winding up and up into the bell tower. The space at the top was barely 6 feet square, open to the elements on all sides through narrow arched windows. The massive bronze bell hung above them, silent and cold. Sister Maria pointed to a corner where blankets had been arranged on the wooden floor. She made a gesture that clearly meant stay here, stay quiet. Then she did something that shocked Jensen to his core. She reached into her habit and pulled out a small photograph. 2 children, a boy maybe 8 years old, a girl perhaps 6. They had dark hair, dark eyes, and expressions far too serious for their ages. Sister Maria pointed to the photograph. Then she pointed down toward the floors below. Then she made a gesture across her throat. The meaning was unmistakable. There are children here, hidden. If discovered, they will be killed. And now you are part of this secret. Jensen felt his stomach drop. He had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. These women weren't just sheltering an enemy airman. They were hiding Jewish children. In Nazi Germany, in January 1945, with the regime growing more paranoid and vicious by the day, the penalty for such an act wasn't imprisonment, it was execution. Immediate, public, brutal. Sister Maria seemed to read his thoughts. She placed her hand on his chest over his heart. Then she placed it on her own. The gesture needed no translation. We are in this together now. Trust, faith, survival. She left him there in the bell tower, alone with his thoughts and the howling wind. Jensen wrapped himself in the blankets and tried to process what had just happened. He had expected betrayal. Instead, he had found sanctuary. But sanctuary came with a price. He was now complicit in an act of resistance that made his own survival seem almost trivial by comparison. The first night was the longest of Carl Jensen's life. The bell tower offered no protection from the elements. Wind cut through the arched openings with razor precision. His breath formed ice crystals on the blankets. His injured ankle throbbed with every heartbeat. But worse than the physical discomfort was the mental torture. Every sound made him flinch. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind, every distant voice could be the Gestapo coming to search the convent. He kept thinking about those children in the cellar. Who were they? How long had they been here? How had these nuns managed to keep them hidden? And why had Sister Maria shown him their photograph? Was it a warning, a test? A way of saying your life is now bound to theirs? As dawn broke over the Bavarian Alps, Jensen got his first clear view of his surroundings. The convent sat on a hillside overlooking a small valley. He could see a village about 2 miles away, smoke rising from chimneys. A road wound through the valley, and even from this distance he could see military vehicles moving along it. German trucks, staff cars. The machinery of a regime in its death throes, growing more desperate by the day. The bell tower gave him a perfect vantage point. He could see anyone approaching long before they reached the convent gates, which he realized was probably exactly why Sister Maria had put him here. He wasn't just being hidden. He was being positioned as a lookout, Around mid-morning, Sister Maria returned with food, more black bread, a boiled egg, weak tea that was nonetheless hot and welcome. She also brought something unexpected, a book, a Latin prayer book, worn and ancient. She opened it and pointed to passages, speaking slowly in German. Jensen shook his head, indicating he didn't understand. Sister Maria tried again, this time pointing to individual words and making gestures. It took Jensen several minutes to grasp what she was trying to tell him. She was teaching him prayers, Latin prayers, Catholic prayers, and then it clicked. If the convent was searched, if he was discovered, his only chance of survival was to pass as something other than an American airman. She was giving him a cover story. A disguise. He could be a Catholic refugee, a displaced person from the East, someone with a reason to be here that didn't involve parachuting out of a burning bomber. Over the next several days, Jensen's education continued. Sister Maria visited twice daily, always bringing food, always bringing lessons. She taught him basic German phrases. She taught him how to cross himself properly. She taught him responses to common prayers. She taught him the rhythms and rituals of convent life. And slowly, painfully, Jensen began to understand the magnitude of what these women had undertaken. The convent housed 4 nuns total. Sister Maria, who seemed to be the leader. Sister Margaret, who was perhaps 70 and nearly deaf. Sister Agnes, who had a persistent cough that worried Jensen every time he heard it. And Sister Clara, the youngest at maybe 50, who had the hardest eyes Jensen had ever seen. Eyes that had witnessed things no person of faith should have to witness. They maintained the convent alone. No priests visited, no other religious officials. They were isolated, forgotten, which was precisely what allowed them to hide 2 Jewish children in their cellar. On the 4th day, Jensen finally saw the children. He was in the bell tower, as always, when he noticed movement in the small courtyard below. The door to the cellar opened, and 2 small figures emerged, blinking in the weak winter sunlight. The boy and girl from the photograph. They looked even thinner in person, even more fragile. Sister Clara stood guard while they walked in circles around the courtyard, stretching their legs, breathing fresh air. The exercise lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then they were ushered back into the darkness. Jensen felt something break inside his chest. These children had been living in a cellar for God knows how long. No sunlight. No space to run or play. No childhood, just survival, just the daily terror of discovery. And these 4 elderly nuns had taken on the burden of keeping them alive. On the 8th day, the Gestapo came. Jensen heard the vehicles before he saw them. The distinctive rumble of German engines growing louder. He peered through the bell tower opening and felt his blood turn to ice. 2 cars, black, official. They pulled up to the convent gate and 4 men in leather coats emerged. Gestapo. No question. He watched as Sister Maria went to meet them at the gate. Even from a distance he could see the tension in her posture. The men spoke to her. She responded. They gestured toward the convent. She shook her head. The conversation continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then one of the men pushed past Sister Maria and entered the courtyard. The others followed. Jensen's hand went to his pistol. If they came up to the bell tower, if they found him, he had already decided he wouldn't be taken alive. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. And more importantly, he wouldn't risk breaking under interrogation and revealing the children. But the search, if it could be called that, was cursory. The men walked through the chapel. They glanced into the nuns' cells. They stood in the courtyard, smoking cigarettes and making comments that Jensen couldn't hear but could imagine. They never checked the cellar. They never climbed to the bell tower. After 20 minutes they left. Jensen watched their cars disappear down the valley road and realized he had been holding his breath. His hands were shaking. His injured ankle throbbed from the tension. When Sister Maria came to him that evening, he could see the fear in her eyes. The Gestapo visit had rattled her. She spoke rapidly in German, and though Jensen couldn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. "They're looking for someone. Maybe you, maybe others. We're being watched now. We have to be more careful." She brought him something new that night, a rosary. She placed it in his hands and closed his fingers around the beads. Then she bowed her head and began to pray in Latin. Jensen, who had been raised Lutheran in Minnesota and hadn't been to church since enlisting, found himself trying to follow along. The words were foreign. The ritual was strange. But the intent was universal. Please God, keep us safe. Please God, let us survive this. Please God, give us strength for what comes next. The weeks that followed established a routine that was both monotonous and terrifying. Jensen spent his days in the bell tower, watching the valley, learning prayers, slowly regaining strength in his ankle. The nuns brought him food twice daily, portions that were growing smaller as winter deepened and supplies dwindled. He realized they were sharing their own rations with him, giving him food they needed for themselves, for the children. The guilt was crushing. He was eating food meant for 2 Jewish children hiding in a cellar. He tried to refuse to give back portions, but Sister Maria was adamant. She made it clear that they were all in this together, all dependent on each other, all equal in their need and their risk. In the 3rd week, something changed. Sister Maria brought him to the chapel late one night when the village below was dark and silent. She led him downstairs he hadn't known existed, through a passage behind the altar, to a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron. She knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice more. The door opened from within, and Jensen found himself face to face with the children. The boy, whose name was David, stared at him with enormous dark eyes. The girl, Rachel, hid behind her brother. They looked like ghosts, pale from lack of sunlight, thin from inadequate food, but alive, miraculously, impossibly alive. Sister Maria spoke to them in German. David responded, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he looked at Jensen and said in heavily accented English, "You are American." Jensen nodded, too moved to speak. "My father," David continued, "he went to America before the war. He was going to send for us, but then—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jensen knelt down, ignoring the pain in his ankle, bringing himself to the children's level. "I'm going to help keep you safe," he said. "We're all going to keep each other safe, until the Americans come, until this is over." David translated for his sister. Rachel's expression didn't change. She had learned not to trust promises, not to hope, not to believe in rescue. She had learned to survive, nothing more. That night marked a turning point. Jensen was no longer just a hidden airman waiting for liberation. He was part of a conspiracy, part of a family of resistors. The nuns, the children, and one American sergeant, all bound together by secrets that could kill them. Sister Maria began to teach him more than just prayers. She taught him the children's story. David and Rachel's parents had been taken in 1943, rounded up with thousands of other Jews from Munich, sent east to places whose names were whispered with horror: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. But the children had been hidden by a Catholic family in the city. When that became too dangerous, they were moved to another family. Then another. An underground railroad of conscience, passing 2 children from hand to hand, keeping them one step ahead of the death machine. They had arrived at the convent in the summer of 1944. Sister Maria had connections to the resistance network, though Jensen never learned the details. The children were supposed to stay for a few weeks. Then the situation would calm down and they could be moved again. But the situation never calmed down. The Nazis grew more paranoid. The searches intensified. The penalties for harboring Jews became more severe. And so David and Rachel remained in the cellar, their temporary shelter becoming a prison that kept them alive. Now it was February 1945. The war was clearly ending. Everyone knew it. The question was whether they could survive until the end arrived. The Gestapo returned twice more in February. Each time, Jensen watched from the bell tower, his heart hammering, his hand on his pistol. Each time the searches grew more thorough. The men spent longer in the courtyard. They asked more questions. They looked at Sister Maria with increasing suspicion. Why was this convent still operating? Where were the other nuns? Why hadn't they been consolidated with larger religious communities? Sister Maria's answers were always the same. They were old. They were harmless. They maintained this holy place as an act of devotion. They bothered no one. But Jensen could see the noose tightening. It was only a matter of time before someone decided to conduct a real search, before someone checked the cellar, before someone climbed the bell tower. The food situation became critical in early March. The nuns' supplies were nearly exhausted. The village was under strict rationing. There was no way to obtain more food without raising questions. Sister Clara, the one with the hard eyes, took to making trips to the village, trading away the convent's possessions for bread and potatoes. A candlestick, a silver plate, a religious icon. Piece by piece, they sold their heritage to buy survival. Jensen watched this sacrifice with growing anguish. These women had given up everything, their safety, their comfort, their possessions, all to protect 2 Jewish children and 1 American airman. He tried to contribute. His emergency kit had included a small fishing line and hooks. On nights when the moon was dark, he would sneak down from the bell tower and try to catch fish from a nearby stream. The catches were small and infrequent, but every fish meant 1 more meal, 1 more day of survival. Sister Agnes's cough grew worse. She developed a fever that wouldn't break. There were no medicines. No doctors they could call without risking exposure. Sister Maria tended to her with herbs and prayers, but they all knew she was dying. On March 12th, Sister Agnes passed away in her sleep. The nuns held a small service in the chapel. Jensen watched from the bell tower, unable to attend, unable to pay his respects to a woman who had risked everything for him. They buried her in the small cemetery behind the convent. 4 graves became 5, and then they were 3. 3 elderly nuns, 2 children, and 1 American airman. The margin for error had just become even thinner. The Gestapo came the next day. Jensen always wondered if it was coincidence or if someone in the village had noticed the burial and reported it. This time there were 6 men. This time they didn't ask permission. They pushed through the gate and began a systematic search. Jensen watched from above, his pistol in his hand, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. If they found the children, what would he do? Could he shoot all 6 men before they could react? Could he get the children and the nuns out? Could he? But there were no good options. There were only degrees of catastrophe. He watched as the men searched the chapel, the cells, the kitchen. They were being thorough, professional. And then one of them pointed to the cellar door. Jensen's blood froze. This was it. This was the moment. But Sister Maria did something extraordinary. She walked directly to the cellar door, pulled out a key, and unlocked it herself. She gestured for the men to enter, speaking in German, her voice calm and steady. The Gestapo men looked surprised. They had expected resistance, secrecy. Instead, they got cooperation. They descended into the cellar. Jensen could hear their footsteps on the stone stairs. He could hear their voices echoing in the underground space. He could hear nothing. No shouts of discovery. No sounds of children being dragged out. Just the Gestapo men emerging a few minutes later, looking disappointed. They searched the rest of the convent, including a cursory glance up the bell tower stairs. But the stairs were steep and narrow, and the men were lazy. They called up, asking if anyone was there. Jensen held his breath, pressed against the wall, invisible from below. After a moment, they gave up and left. When Sister Maria came to him that night, Jensen demanded to know what had happened. How had the children not been discovered? Sister Maria smiled. It was the first time Jensen had seen her smile. She explained, through gestures and the few German words he had learned, that the cellar had a hidden room, a space behind a false wall, built centuries ago when the convent had been used to hide religious artifacts during various wars and persecutions. The children had been moved there before the Gestapo arrived. They had been trained to stay absolutely silent, no matter what they heard, no matter how scared they were. David and Rachel had hidden in that space, in complete darkness, barely breathing, while Nazi officers walked within feet of them. And they had survived. Jensen felt something shift inside him. These weren't victims waiting for rescue. These were fighters, warriors. David and Rachel, two children who should have been playing and learning and growing, had instead mastered the art of survival through absolute discipline and courage. The nuns, who should have been spending their final years in prayer and peace, had instead become resistance operatives, outmaneuvering the Gestapo through cunning and faith. And Jensen realized that his role here wasn't to protect them. They were protecting each other. He was just one more person in the circle of mutual survival. March turned to April. The sounds of war grew closer. Jensen could hear artillery in the distance, a constant rumble like thunder that never ended. The Americans were coming. The Third Reich was collapsing, but collapse made the Nazis more dangerous, not less. Desperate men do desperate things. The village below began to empty. Civilians fled west, trying to stay ahead of the Soviet advance from the east. Wehrmacht units retreated through the valley, ragged and defeated, and the Gestapo made one final visit. April 18, 1945. 7 men this time, and they brought dogs. Jensen watched them approach and knew this was different. This was the end game. The dogs would smell the children, would smell him. There was no hiding from dogs. He made his decision in seconds. He climbed down from the bell tower, moving as quietly as possible. He found Sister Maria in the chapel and grabbed her arm. He pointed to himself, then to the gate, then made a gesture of running. His meaning was clear. I'll lead them away. I'll make them chase me. Give the children a chance. Sister Maria understood immediately. She also refused immediately. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength and shook her head violently. No. They argued in gestures and broken language, precious seconds ticking away. The dogs were getting closer. Finally, Sister Clara intervened. She pulled Jensen aside and spoke directly to him in German. He didn't understand the words, but he understood her tone. She was giving orders, and those orders were to stay hidden, to trust them, to have faith. The Gestapo entered the courtyard. The dogs strained at their leashes, barking, excited. The men spread out, beginning their search. And Sister Maria did something that Jensen would never forget. She walked to the center of the courtyard and rang the chapel bell. The sound was enormous, overwhelming, echoing off the mountains. The dogs went crazy, barking and howling in response to the noise. The Gestapo men shouted at her to stop, but she kept ringing the bell, again and again, the sound drowning out everything else. Drowning out any sounds the children might make, any sounds Jensen might make, drowning out the dog's ability to track scents through the confusion of noise and chaos. The men finally grabbed her, pulling her away from the bell rope. They shouted questions. She responded calmly, explaining that she was calling the faithful to prayer, that it was the appointed hour, that she was simply following her religious duties. They didn't believe her. They struck her. Jensen watched from the bell tower, his pistol in his hand, every muscle in his body screaming at him to intervene. But he stayed hidden, because that's what she wanted. That's what would keep the children safe. The search continued for 2 hours. The dogs were brought through every room. They sniffed the cellar. They sniffed the chapel. They even climbed partway up the bell tower stairs before the narrow passage defeated them. But the bell's ringing had done its job. The dogs were confused, overstimulated. Their tracking ability was compromised. They found nothing. As the Gestapo prepared to leave, their leader approached Sister Maria. He spoke to her for a long moment. Jensen couldn't hear the words, but he could see the threat in the man's posture. "We know you're hiding something. We'll be back. We'll find it. And when we do, you'll hang." Sister Maria's response was to bow her head and cross herself. The Gestapo left, and the convent fell silent except for the sound of Sister Maria weeping, not from fear, from relief. They had survived. Again. The next 3 days were the longest of Jensen's life. They all knew the Gestapo would return. They all knew the next search would be even more thorough. They all knew their luck had run out. But on April 21, 1945, everything changed. Jensen was in the bell tower when he saw them, American tanks, rolling up the valley road, Sherman tanks with white stars on their hulls, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. The German units in the valley didn't fight. They surrendered or fled. Within hours, American troops had secured the area. Jensen wanted to run down immediately to reveal himself to end this nightmare. But Sister Maria stopped him. "Not yet," she indicated. "Wait, make sure." That night, an American patrol came to the convent. A lieutenant and 4 soldiers looking for German holdouts. Jensen finally descended from the bell tower. He walked into the courtyard in his civilian clothes, raised his hands, and said in English, "Sergeant Carl Jensen, United States Army Air Forces. Serial number 3725948-2. The lieutenant's jaw dropped. The soldiers raised their weapons, then lowered them in confusion, and Jensen explained everything. The crash, the nuns, the children, the months of hiding, the Gestapo searches, the daily terror and the daily miracles. The lieutenant called for his captain. The captain called for his colonel. Within hours, the convent was swarming with American soldiers. Medics checked everyone's health. Intelligence officers took statements. A chaplain came to speak with the nuns, and David and Rachel emerged from the cellar into daylight, blinking like newborn creatures, holding hands, terrified and hopeful and alive. The children were taken to a displaced persons camp. The nuns were interviewed extensively, and Carl Jensen was debriefed, treated for malnutrition and his still healing ankle, and eventually sent back to the United States. He tried to stay in touch with Sister Maria. He wrote letters. He sent packages, but communication with occupied Germany was difficult, and eventually the letters stopped coming back. He never knew what happened to her. To Sister Margaret and Sister Clara, to David and Rachel. For years, that uncertainty haunted him. Then, in 1963, Jensen received a letter. It was from Israel. From a man named David Rosenfeld, who was a doctor in Tel Aviv. who had a sister named Rachel, a teacher in Jerusalem, who remembered an American sergeant who had shared their hiding place during the last months of the war. David's letter explained that Sister Maria had died in 1952, Sister Clara in 1955. Sister Margaret had lived until 1960. They had continued to run the convent until their deaths, continuing to help people in need, continuing to live their faith through action. The letter included photographs, David and Rachel as adults, healthy, successful, alive. They had families of their own now, children who would never know the terror their parents had survived, and they wanted Jensen to know that they remembered, that they were grateful, that 4 nuns and 1 American airman had given them the greatest gift possible: a future. Jensen kept that letter until his death in 1998. He kept the rosary Sister Maria had given him. He kept the memories of those 16 weeks when he learned that courage doesn't always look like combat. Sometimes it looks like an elderly nun ringing a bell to confuse Nazi dogs. Sometimes it looks like 2 children staying silent in the darkness while their hunters walk overhead. Sometimes it looks like sharing communion wafers as rations because that's all the food there is. The story of Carl Jensen and the Bavarian convent became known gradually. He spoke about it rarely, and only in his later years. He was never comfortable being called a hero. He insisted that the real heroes were Sister Maria and her fellow nuns, were David and Rachel, who survived through strength that children should never have to possess, were the countless unnamed people who formed the Underground Railroad that kept 2 Jewish children alive through years of genocide. But historians who studied his case noted something profound. Jensen's experience revealed a hidden truth about occupied Europe. For every collaborator, there were quiet resistors. For every betrayal, there were acts of sanctuary. For every person who chose evil, there were people who chose conscience. The nuns of that Bavarian convent were not unique. They were part of a vast, invisible network of ordinary people who became extraordinary through daily choices, who looked at the machinery of genocide and said, "No, not here, not these children, not on my watch. They didn't have weapons, they didn't have training, they didn't have resources. They had only their faith, their courage, and their fundamental human decency. And somehow, impossibly, it was enough." The convent still stands today. It's no longer active as a religious community. It's been converted into a small museum dedicated to the resistance efforts in Bavaria during the final years of the war. There's a plaque commemorating Sister Maria, Sister Margaret, Sister Agnes, and Sister Clara. There's a photograph of David and Rachel as children, and as adults. And there's a display about Sergeant Carl Jensen, the American airman who crash-landed into a story of resistance and shared 16 weeks with heroes who wore habits instead of uniforms. Visitors to the museum can climb the bell tower. They can see the space where Jensen hid, where he watched the valley, where he learned Latin prayers to maintain his cover. They can see the cellar with its hidden room, the space behind the false wall where 2 children learned to become invisible. They can stand in the chapel where Sister Maria rang the bell to drown out the Nazi dogs, and they can ask themselves the question that Jensen asked himself every day for the rest of his life. What would I have done? If I had been Sister Maria, would I have opened that door to an enemy airman? If I had been those nuns, would I have risked everything for 2 Jewish children I didn't know? If I had been Jensen, would I have stayed silent in the bell tower while an elderly nun was beaten by the Gestapo? Would I have had the courage to be part of that conspiracy of conscience? The answer matters, because the situations that require such courage don't end with World War II. They recur throughout history. They're happening somewhere in the world right now. Someone is being asked to choose between safety and conscience, between self-preservation and protecting the vulnerable, between going along with evil and standing against it. The story of Carl Jensen and the Bavarian convent reminds us that such choices are possible, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that faith, whether religious or simply faith in human dignity, can be a form of resistance. That even in the darkest times, even when the machinery of evil seems unstoppable, individual acts of conscience matter. They save lives. They preserve humanity. They light candles in the darkness. 4 elderly nuns and 1 American airman held back the night for 16 weeks. They kept 2 children alive. They kept each other alive. They kept their humanity alive. And in doing so, they became part of something larger than themselves, part of the resistance, part of the conscience of humanity, part of the proof that evil, no matter how powerful, can never fully extinguish the human capacity for goodness. That's the real shock Carl Jensen experienced in that Bavarian convent. Not that the nuns helped him, not that they hid Jewish children, but that such goodness was possible at all. That in the heart of Nazi Germany, in the final desperate months of the Third Reich, there were still people who chose light over darkness, who chose life over death, who chose to be human when the world around them had gone insane. And that choice, repeated daily for 16 weeks, made all the difference.